U.S. and local history. Popular depictions of U.S. and local history reflect not only specific events, but also how we think of ourselves as a nation and what we think about specific regions or ethnic groups in our country. We can go into a story set in a specific subculture in the U.S. without a lot of backstory, because as Americans, we bring with us knowledge and understanding, as well as preconceived notions and stereotypes. Think about how you would describe ourselves as Americans. What ideas and shared understanding do we have about Westerners, Southerners, or New Yorkers? Here's a story about a New York City police detective and a Texas Ranger chasing down the same criminal. You can fill in most of the details about the characters' backgrounds, personalities, and conflicts yourself without seeing anything beyond these photos. You will not be surprised to know that after their initial clash, they discovered a mutual code of justice and honor and teamed up to get the bad guy, each of them finding new respect for the other's way of life and work. But what if you were Korean, or Spanish, or Nigerian? Would you have the instant recognition of each of these characters' backgrounds, lifestyles, probable religion, and political affiliations? Sure, you could follow the plot, but you could not instantly read all of the cultural implications as Americans can. And what kind of people are these? What is their background, profession, religion, political affiliation? What time period is being depicted? We can assume that Indian, South African, and Korean audiences view these films with a much greater understanding of the nuances of culture than any of us could. Again, we can follow the plot, but we don't know all the details about what we're missing. We are also far more sensitive about portrayals of our own culture and religion than we are about others. As Floridians, we might recognize these good old boys and laugh along. Or we might be offended. After all, not all Floridians are barefoot swamp dwellers. Some of us live in glittering cities fought over by drug kingpins and slick detectives at all-night dance parties, while the happiest place on earth is crammed full of awkward Midwestern tourists. Meanwhile, the whole state is filled with Florida man and his many relatives, all up to their usual comically crazy, dangerous, and criminal hijinks. Although familiarity with preconceived ideas about different aspects of our shared culture can be useful shortcuts in narrative, pervasive negative stereotypes and controversial depictions of race, nationality, regional, or political divides can create a public backlash. People take the portrayal of their own history and identity very seriously and will protest against what they view as an inaccurate or unfair treatment in the media. Since the rise of popular culture set at the turn of the 20th century, anti-defamation leagues have formed to protest negative portrayals of Italians, Jews, African Americans, and homosexuals. Just last month, the publication of the novel American Dirt sparked widespread criticism and protest from Hispanics over the book's depiction of their culture. 105 years ago, the NAACP was organizing protests against portrayals of African Americans in the 1915 film Birth of a Nation. The Catholic Legion of Decency was founded in 1933 as an organization dedicated to identifying and combating objectionable content in motion pictures from the point of view of the American Catholic Church. Today, the Catholic Church is still active in reviewing popular culture and organizes protests and boycotts against media they feel defames faith and religion. The American Italian Anti-Defamation League was formed to combat the stereotype that Italian Americans are all connected to the mob. Fashion changes, and so do our views of ourselves and of our own history. Films and other forms of popular culture portray our belief and attitudes at the time they were made. Even historical stories set in the past give evidence of the cultural norms of the writers, filmmakers, and the audience at the time they were made. Next, we're going to look at some of the examples about how our attitudes, prejudice, ideals about our own national identity have changed over the years, and how that evolution has been captured on film. In many cases, the changes have been needed corrections to racist ideas, In other cases, the pendulum has swung into idealism and fantasy. Westerns are the most American of all genres. Western novels have been with us since the 1880s. Westerns were among the first films and TV shows, and they are still relevant today. Westerns reflect every aspect of our culture, including race relations, the Cold War, Vietnam, fads, sex, violence, and religion. Whoever you are, conservative, liberal, anti-establishment, law and order, black, Chinese, lesbian, there's a Western for you. We'll just look at one aspect of the Western, the portrayal of Native Americans. In the early days, Indians were portrayed as the enemy, dangerous savages who must be fought for our own survival. By the 1960s, Native Americans were joining the civil rights protests on their own behalf, and films began to portray them with respect. By the 1990s, national remorse over the historic treatment of indigenous peoples elevated them to a mythic status of purity and simplicity. The historical truths about Native Americans are as complex as any national history, but theirs is simplified for the movies. The depiction of race relations between blacks and whites in America has swung even further. In Birth of a Nation, newly freed slaves were savages taking over the government and attacking white women. Thank goodness for the heroic KKK. In 1939, blacks were accepted in the white film world as servants, entertainers, or comic relief. In 1969, things changed radically with the first strong black leading man partnering with a skeptical white man. Equal partnership and the black-white police partnership was born. By the late 80s, black characters became the heroic lead, and the more famous white actor was the supporting character. And by 2012, almost 100 years after Birth of a Nation, America was ready to cheer on Django, the freed slave, while he killed nearly every white person he encountered and burned the plantation to the ground. So while you're working on this section, ask yourself, is this story about something larger than the main incidents and characters? Is it telling some sort of national or local identity story? Is this story saying something about America or Americans in general, either at the time the story is set or at the time that it was made? Does it rely on assumptions or stereotypes about national, regional, or local culture? And also think about when the film was made, in addition to when the film was set. Does it reflect the attitudes at that time? Does it reflect those attitudes today? Would non-Americans understand the concept, or would they be confused? And finally, could you use this to teach history?